Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going back to the world of Dystopia Rising to discuss what are the most practical weapons to use in-game. Let's get started, go! So for those of you who don't know, Dystopia Rising runs on a lightest touch combat system. So this video isn't necessarily about what's the best weapon in-game. That has more to do with personal fighting style. This has more to do with what's the best weapon to use that will adhere best to that kind of rule system, as well as talk about practicality, reliability, and cost. Okay, so first up you have your standard foam latex professionally made LARP weapon. I wouldn't recommend this for Dystopia Rising combat simply because the foam is a lot more rigid and a lot more firm, and that would apply a lot more force when striking in combat, which means it'll hurt more when it hits someone. You can use a weapon like this in Dystopia Rising. I would just recommend practicing with it a lot first. And I'd recommend hitting people with the flattest side of the weapon so that way it has more surface area so when it hits someone it doesn't hurt as much. Next up you have your Walmart brand foam swords. Now this is probably the best weapon that you can buy on a budget simply because its material is nice and soft, so you won't have to worry about hurting someone when you're striking them in combat. However, the biggest problem with this kind of weapon is that it's fairly easy to break. And while with Dystopia Rising's combat you shouldn't really be doing anything that will apply this much strain to your weapon, if your weapon does happen to break, you're screwed. Now last up in terms of melee weapons, you have your standard boffer weapon. Now I'd prefer this weapon over the last two simply because it's far more durable. It also has far more padding and a larger surface area, so when you strike another player it's not going to hurt as much as say with the foam latex weapon. It's also relatively low cost and easy to make. Now let's get on to firearms. Now when choosing the right firearm for you, you have to balance practicality with reliability and ammo capacity. Now first up you have your 2-shot pump action shotgun. Now the biggest problem with this is that it only holds 2 bullets. Now in a combat situation where you need to do as much damage to your opponent as humanly possible, 2 shots really aren't going to cut it unless they're backed up by special abilities. And if you're a new player, that's not going to last you long either. Next, we have our battery-powered dart guns. This one in particular has actually never failed to fire when I use it. The only real problem I see with it is that it's run on a battery, and eventually that battery is going to die. And if that battery dies in the middle of combat, the gun becomes useless. And if it becomes useless, you're screwed. Next, we have our off-brand types. Now this one's a double-edged sword because while its ammo is unique and can't be used with other Nerf guns, other dart type guns, because the problem I've had with Dystopia Rising is when I show up with a Nerf gun and I fire several dozen bullets, I only end up getting half them back because other players will end up picking them up and taking off and I never see them again. That won't necessarily happen with the off-brand types of guns because those type of bullets won't work with their Nerf guns. But at the same time, if you lose those bullets, it's going to be very difficult to find replacements for them when they're lost. Next up, you have your bolt-action magazine types. Now this is probably the most commonly used type of weapon in Dystopia Rising. However, the biggest problem is that when you're in an intense combat situation where you're just hammering on that bolt action, firing as many bullets as possible, that makes the gun susceptible to jamming. And if the gun jams in the middle of combat, that gives you the same problem as the battery-powered weapon. Makes it useless, and then you're screwed. Now lastly, in terms of big weapons, you got your pump action revolver types. This one right here, I call crowd control. And this is the gun I recommend the most because this kind of gun never fails to fire. The only actual time it will fail to fire is if the bullet's sticking out and it blocks the cylinder from rotating, but it's just as easy to fix as just going not the same as if your bullet gets jammed in the barrel of your bolt action here, in which case you have to fish it out, which will take a significant amount of time to do. Not the case with the Mega, and in terms of the bullet size, I kind of take the Hellboy stance on this. Now let's get on to pistols. First up, you have your slider action types like the Maverick here that holds 6 bullets, while you have the Hammer Shot that holds 5. Now for those of you who might jump the gun, you might come to the conclusion that you want the Maverick simply because it holds more bullets. However, the biggest problem with the Maverick is that it's designed to be fired with 2 hands. So if you're in the middle of combat and someone mangles one of your arms, it makes it a little bit harder to use your gun. Maybe not a whole lot, but definitely an inconvenience, while with the Hammer Shot, it can be entirely fired with 1 hand. Now lastly, let's talk about non-firing prop-based weapons. I was asked in the comments section if a player could show up with a non-firing replica to act as their weapon. The answer is yes, however, first of all you need to have a yellow tip on the end to identify it as a fake gun. I don't think you'd be able to use a weapon like this that's actually made of real metal. And another thing, if you're going for a non-firing prop, you should probably make it out of foam, that way you can use it with a special ability known as Pistol Whip. Also, you're going to need to have packets with you to throw to act as your physical rep for the damage that you land on other players. And frankly, with all that being the case, I feel like it's just a lot more practical to just simply use a Nerf gun instead. Anyway, that's just my take on one of the most practical weapons to use in Dystopia Rising's combat. If you feel like I've earned it, please give me a like. If you want to see more, give me a subscribe, and have a great rest of your day. See ya.